What if wealth inequality isn't a modern problem that developed recently due to technology or globalization, but is actually the natural end state of every civilization in history, and every empire follows the exact same pattern? Start with relatively equal wealth distribution during the building phase, then concentrate wealth at the top during the extraction phase, until the concentration becomes so extreme it triggers collapse. 2025, the richest 1% of Americans own 35% of all wealth in the country, while the bottom 50% own just 2%. 8 billionaires control as much wealth as the poorest 3.8 billion people on Earth combined. Elon Musk's net worth fluctuates by more in a single day than most people will earn in their entire lives. This seems unprecedented, uniquely modern, a product of digital capitalism and tech monopolies. But here's the truth that history reveals. Wealth concentration in 2025 America is roughly identical to Rome in 100 AD, identical to France before the Revolution in 1789, identical to Gilded Age America in 1900, identical to every empire at peak extraction before collapse. The pattern is so consistent across 3,000 years of civilization that it's clearly not accidental, it's structural. This is the story of how wealth concentration follows predictable patterns throughout history, why empires always concentrate wealth during their decline phase while distributing it more broadly during their rise, how the mechanisms of concentration are designed not accidental, and why understanding this pattern reveals that modern inequality isn't a bug in the system. It's the system working exactly as empires work when extraction replaces creation. Let's start with Rome because it's the clearest historical example of the concentration pattern over time. Early Roman Republic, approximately 500 BC to 200 BC, had relatively distributed wealth. Small farmers owned land, soldiers were citizens who fought for the Republic and returned to their farms, and although wealthy patrician families existed, the gap between rich and poor was manageable. The Licinian section laws of 367 BC actually limited how much public land any one person could control, 500 iudera maximum, roughly 300 acres, to prevent concentration. But as Rome expanded through conquest, wealth flooded into the city from Carthage, Greece, Asia Minor, and eventually Gaul and Egypt. This conquest wealth concentrated in the hands of generals, senators, and those who controlled the distribution of seized assets. By 100 BC, the latifundia system had emerged, massive agricultural estates worked by enslaved people, owned by wealthy Romans who'd bought up or seized the small farms of citizens. By the time of Augustus in 1 BC, wealth concentration was extreme. The historian Walter Schadel estimates that in the early Roman Empire, the top 1% controlled roughly 40% of all wealth, similar to modern America. The bottom 70% of Romans lived at or near subsistence level. Senator fortunes were measured in millions of sesterces, while average citizens earned a few hundred annually. Here's what they don't teach you about how this happened. The transition from distributed to concentrated wealth wasn't gradual evolution. It was systematic theft legalized through policy. Roman senators passed the Lex Claudia in 218 BC prohibiting senators from owning large merchant ships, supposedly to prevent conflicts of interest. But the real effect was forcing small merchants to partner with or sell to senatorial families who controlled the capital to circumvent the law. When small farmers went to war, which Rome required, they couldn't work their fields. Crops failed, debts accumulated, creditors foreclosed. The same senators who sent farmers to war bought their foreclosed land at pennies on the denarius. Within 3 generations, the citizen farmer class that built the Republic was gone, replaced by landless urban poor dependent on grain doles, while senators owned estates the size of small cities. This wasn't accidental market dynamics. This was designed wealth transfer, using law and war to extract from the many and concentrate to the few. The mechanism of how concentration happens reveals this is designed, not accidental. Wealth concentrates through several interlocking systems that empires always develop during their extraction phase. First, debt and compound interest mathematically guarantee wealth transfer from borrowers to lenders over time. If you lend money at 10% interest and the borrower repays, you profit. If the borrower defaults, you seize collateral worth more than the loan. Either way, lenders accumulate wealth and borrowers lose it, and this happens millions of times across an economy until wealth pools at the top. Ancient Rome had this: wealthy Romans lent to small farmers, farmers defaulted during bad harvests, and creditors seized their land, creating the latifundia estates. Medieval Europe had this: peasants borrowed from lords, defaulted, and became serfs working land they once owned. Modern America has this: credit cards at 22% interest, mortgages, student loans, and medical debt that transfer wealth from the 99% to banks and creditors. Second, asset ownership concentrates because those with capital buy productive assets that generate returns, while those without capital rent or borrow, creating feedback loop where owners accumulate while renters stagnate. A Roman senator who owned latifundia generated wealth from enslaved labor producing grain. A landless Roman citizen paid rent and got poorer. A medieval lord who owned land collected rent from peasants. The peasants paid rent and stayed poor. A modern billionaire who owns corporations, real estate, and stock portfolios generates passive income. Workers who rent and have no capital accumulation stay in the working class. The math is simple. If you own assets that appreciate and generate income, you get richer. If you don't own assets and pay rent to those who do, you get poorer. Over time, this creates insurmountable wealth gaps. But here's where it gets worse, and this is the part that proves concentration is a feature, not a bug. Third, political power follows wealth, and wealth uses political power to rig the system for more extraction. Roman senators passed laws exempting themselves from taxes while taxing conquered provinces. They made debt contracts legally enforceable with collateral seizure, but made it illegal for debtors to flee their creditors, turning debt into inescapable bondage. They controlled the grain supply and used it to pacify the urban poor with free bread while maintaining policies that prevented those same poor from ever owning productive land again. Medieval nobility claimed divine right to own land and exempted themselves from taxes while taxing peasants. They passed sumptuary laws preventing commoners from owning certain goods or wearing certain clothes, literally encoding class hierarchy into law. They maintained feudal systems where peasants legally couldn't leave the land they worked, creating hereditary poverty enforced by state violence. Modern billionaires fund political campaigns, lobby for tax cuts, and write laws that benefit capital over labor. They legalized stock buybacks in 1982, previously considered stock manipulation, allowing corporations to transfer trillions from productive investment to shareholder wealth. They've rewritten tax codes so capital gains are taxed at 15%, while labor is taxed at 37%, making it official policy that wealth from ownership is valued higher than wealth from work. When wealth concentrates enough to control politics, it changes laws to accelerate concentration, creating runaway feedback loop that continues until collapse or revolution breaks it. France before the revolution demonstrates how extreme concentration becomes unsustainable and triggers collapse. 1789, on the eve of revolution, France had approximately 28 million people divided into three estates: clergy, nobility, and everyone else. The first estate, clergy, was approximately 130,000 people, roughly 0.5% of population, owning 10% of land and paying minimal taxes. The second estate, nobility, was approximately 400,000 people, 1.5% of population, owning 30% of land and exempt from most taxes. The third estate, everyone else, was 27 million people, 98% of population, owning 60% of land but paying virtually all taxes. Within the third estate, wealth was further concentrated. The bourgeoisie and wealthy merchants owned most of that 60%, while peasants and urban workers owned almost nothing. The top 1% of France, approximately 280,000 people, controlled roughly 50% of all wealth, while 90% of French citizens lived in poverty. The concentration was so extreme that when crop failures in 1788 created food shortages, people starved while nobility feasted. The political system was rigged to maintain concentration. The Estates General gave each estate one vote, meaning clergy and nobility with 1.5% of population had 2 votes, and commoners with 98% had 1 vote. The extraction was unsustainable. Revolution erupted in 1789, monarchy fell, nobility lost their heads, and wealth was forcibly redistributed through confiscation and land redistribution. The French Revolution was economic collapse manifesting as political upheaval, and the trigger was wealth concentration so extreme it became mathematically impossible for the system to continue. And here's the pattern that should terrify you. This exact cycle repeated in America barely a century later. Gilded Age America shows the pattern repeating in industrial capitalism with identical results. 1870 to 1900, America industrialized rapidly, and wealth concentrated at unprecedented speed. John D. Rockefeller controlled 90% of oil refining by 1890 and became the richest person in history with wealth equivalent to over $400 billion today. Andrew Carnegie controlled U.S. steel production and was worth approximately $370 billion in modern dollars. J.P. Morgan controlled banking, railroads, and formed U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation. The top 1% owned roughly 40% of wealth, identical to Rome in 100 AD and similar to 2025 America. Workers earned $1 to $2 per day, while industrialists earned millions annually. The ratio of CEO compensation to average worker, which had been roughly 30 to 1 in 1860, exceeded 300 to 1 by 1900. Child labor was common, working conditions were deadly, and unions were violently suppressed by private armies hired by corporations. The Homestead Strike of 1892 saw Carnegie hire 300 Pinkerton agents to break the Union, a literal private army shooting American workers to maintain profit margins. The Ludlow Massacre of 1914 had Rockefeller-hired guards machine-gunning striking coal miners and their families, killing dozens including children. This was wealth concentration enforced through violence, and it was legal because the concentrated wealth controlled the government writing the laws. The concentration triggered progressive-era reforms, antitrust laws, labor protections, income taxes on the wealthy, because the alternative was revolution. Teddy Roosevelt broke up Standard Oil in 1911 not because he was socialist, but because concentration threatened stability. When 1% owns 40% and uses private armies to maintain it, you're one food shortage away from guillotines. The reforms slowed concentration but didn't reverse it, and by the 1920s wealth had reconcentrated enough that, when the crash came in 1929, it triggered the Great Depression. Extreme concentration makes economies fragile because the wealthy hoard rather than spend, reducing aggregate demand, creating deflationary spirals, and making systems vulnerable to shocks. The top 0.1% owned 25% of wealth in 1929. By 1933, unemployment hit 25% and GDP collapsed 30%. It took a world war and massive redistribution through taxes and social programs to break the concentration cycle. Now here's the part that connects directly to your life right now, and this is where the pattern becomes undeniable. The modern implications reveal we're in late-stage concentration phase identical to pre-collapse empires. In 1980, the top 1% in America owned 23% of wealth. By 2025, they own 35%. In 1980, CEO-to-worker pay ratio was 42 to 1. By 2025, it's 350 to 1, higher than Gilded Age, higher than pre-revolutionary France when adjusted for living standards. The median American household has net worth of approximately $140,000. The top 1% averages $11 million. Billionaires exist, 800 in America, 3,000 globally, controlling trillions while billions live in poverty. This concentration isn't happening because billionaires work harder or create more value. It's happening through the same mechanisms that concentrated wealth in Rome, France, and the Gilded Age: debt trapping citizens while enriching creditors, asset appreciation benefiting owners while renters fall behind, and political capture allowing wealth to rewrite laws for further extraction. Stock buybacks, illegal until 1982, now transfer trillions from corporate treasuries to shareholders. Tax rates on the wealthy dropped from 91% top marginal rate in 1963 to 37% today, while payroll taxes on workers increased. Minimum wage in 1968 was equivalent to roughly $24 per hour in 2025 dollars, but actual minimum wage is $7.25, a 69% real wage decline for the poorest workers, while billionaire wealth increased 1,000%. And here's the mechanism proving this is deliberately designed extraction, not accidental market forces. Every single policy change that accelerated concentration from 1980 to 2025 was lobbied for and written by the wealth class benefiting from it. The 1986 Tax Reform Act that dropped top rates from 70 to 28%, lobbied by corporations, and passed by politicians funded by those same corporations. The Financial Services Modernization Act of 1999, repealing Glass-Steagall and allowing banks to become too big to fail, written by banking industry lobbyists. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act giving corporations permanent cuts while giving workers temporary cuts that expire, written by corporate lobby groups and passed by politicians receiving millions in campaign contributions from those corporations. Citizens United in 2010, allowing unlimited corporate money in politics, argued for by corporations wanting to buy legislation. This is extraction economics in real time. Wealth uses political power to rewrite rules for more extraction, and history shows what comes next, either forced redistribution through policy and taxation, or violent redistribution through revolution and collapse. Rome tried neither and collapsed over 400 years of slow decay. France tried neither until revolution forced it through mass executions. America tried redistribution during the New Deal, and it worked. Concentration dropped, middle class grew, economy boomed. But we've systematically reversed those policies since 1980, and concentration is back to pre-collapse levels. This is the empire economy, where we decode systems operating in plain sight but rarely explained honestly. Wealth concentration isn't a modern problem caused by technology or capitalism gone wrong. It's the predictable end stage of every empire in history, following identical patterns. Rome concentrated wealth from distributed small farms to latifundia estates owned by senators, reaching 40% controlled by the top 1% before collapse. France concentrated wealth until clergy and nobility, 1.5%, controlled 40% while 98% starved, triggering revolution in 1789. Gilded Age America concentrated wealth until Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan controlled industries, and the ratio of executive to worker pay exceeded 300 to 1, forcing progressive-era reforms to prevent revolution. Every empire follows this pattern. Wealth distributes during the building phase when production and innovation dominate, then concentrates during the extraction phase when rent-seeking and monopoly dominate, and concentration accelerates until it triggers collapse or forced redistribution. 2025, America has wealth concentration matching Rome before the fall, matching France before the Revolution, matching the Gilded Age before reforms. The top 1% owns 35%, CEO pay is 350 times worker pay, and 8 billionaires control as much as the poorest half of humanity. This isn't capitalism functioning, it's late-stage empire extraction. The dark truth about wealth distribution in history is that concentration always precedes collapse, and we're watching the exact same pattern unfold in real time. The question isn't whether extreme concentration is sustainable. History proves it's not. The question is whether redistribution happens through policy or revolution, and empires rarely choose policy until revolution forces it.